I was trying to decide what to talk about for this thing, and I had a look at, I went back and had a look at what was the state of Secure Scuttlebutt at the last DTN. And I was kind of shocked and horrified to see that the last commit was by Paul Frazee, now works in Beaker Browser, to set the maximum message size at 8 kilobytes. And it's like, that was like so, there was like, that is so ancient history. Like, that is like so far back in like what we have things that like, that's just a thing that's like, let's just not touch that ever again, is how we think about that now. I looked around the rest of the code base and was like, there are a couple of things that were, that we still have today that was like in place at that time, but there were so many things that happened after that that had, we hadn't actually even thought of yet. And I watched my talk from the last DTN, and I'm talking about like all the ideas of what Scuttlebutt could be and where it could go and what kind of thinking led to there. And now I have a very different perspective of like, this is what worked and this is what we've learned in the last 4 years. And some of those things were things that didn't work out or things that were harder than we thought, or things that we talked about a lot and didn't quite get to. But before I go into that, I'd like to share a bit of the history from what I recall that of how DTN and this sort of thing came to be. And the thing is basically, DTN is really a StackVM conference. And StackVM was an IRC channel that Substack started back, I don't know, like a decade ago or something like that. That was so basically there was sort of a perfect storm for creating a community that led to this sort of thing and StackVM is like an identifiable point. So it was, so for me personally, I was like, in like 2009, I was like being a hippie, and then I decided that it was too easy, I needed to do something hard, and I decided to do a hard computer thing, and then I just discovered Node.js, and I was like, oh, this is like, you have the expression, you know, no one gets fired for using IBM. At this time, you would definitely get fired for using Node.js. And I was like, this is perfect. This is like all of the crazy people. Like the thing that made it so good is there was like, to that point, JavaScript had been purely front-end code. There was no back-end like history at all. So we had to write that all from scratch. And the people were there were the people that this actually appealed to. It's like we get to like make our own mark on what this thing is. And there was no like, there were no like grown-ups telling us what to do. We were just like, we're like, oh, this is exciting, this is exciting. And I was like, had been living in a hammock, but I saved up enough money and quit my job, and I went to the first conference in Portland that Michael, who's in the audience, had organized. I was the person who'd come the furthest to attend that. And then later I ended up sleeping in Substack's spare room for a few weeks. And Substack had an IRC channel called StackVM. And everyone in the IRC channel just seemed like really like amazing hackers. And so I was like, oh yeah. And so whenever I met someone that was doing really interesting stuff, I would invite them to StackVM. And I never like talked about it publicly or never posted the stuff. It was just like one-to-one human stuff. Now StackVM is kind of like, you know, the cell has split into different things. So I can tell you the secrets of StackVM without ruining the vibe anymore. But yeah, and then that started to get out of hand. And then I mean, it was just like Substack's little channel. And then like after a few years, Substack told me that, oh, you just invited all these people, all these awesome people, and now we had this thing. And that was like not, yeah, it was sort of like accidental, and a lot of like all of the projects that are sort of represented here have been like influenced through various angles that have come off StackVM. And one of the things when I go back and look at this, I realized there were some things that where like you can influence. There's two ways you can sort of be influenced. You could be influenced positively and negatively. Like you can learn from someone's successes or their mistakes. And sometimes you don't know if you might perceive something as a mistake and they might disagree. So you might try a different thing just to see which one is better. And that is still being influenced by each other. So that's still important collaboration. One example of this is back in 2012, I think, or maybe 2011. I was doing a lot of like Node.js stuff with Node.js streams, and Gozala and Reynos, who were here, were playing with these things called reducibles, and they were different to Node.js. They were like, I was sort of committed to Node.js streams at the time, and they were doing a different thing. They were doing a thing that was totally different, but it had some really interesting properties, and one was that back pressure was propagated instantly. So if you stopped reading from the stream, the source would just stop immediately. But Node.js had this thing where it would sort of like back up a little bit. There'd be a bit of a traffic jam that would then flow through, and it was like it was ugly, really. But then they had this other problem where because they had just one argument to the thing, just one hole that things flowed through, when an error or a special signal like the end of the stream ends, or the error, or there was an error, especially the error was the problem, I think. It would, you'd have to check the type of that message, of that object, and because the way Node.js installed modules, wasn't guaranteed that that would be the single thing in the JavaScript heap. So that didn't work. And then when Streams 2 came along, I was like, Streams 2 was like terrible. It was just like all of this, like just a lot of more stuff piled on top of it. And I was like, I want something that's like ruthlessly simple. And I started experimenting and came up with pull streams, also because of Reynos had the idea of like making it a callback, which I now think is actually a bad idea, but it still carried us a long way. I made it have two arguments so that the error was always a separate field than the value, and so there was no ambiguity, which was like a negative influence from reducibles. Some other interesting things that happened is there was this conference in Dublin called No.2, funnily enough, and they had I ended up speaking at this, where this was sort of this was my big break as a code personality, because I wore a Doritos bag on my head. Everyone, and I had read the Amazon Dynamo paper, so I knew a little bit more about distributed systems than the audience, than everyone else. And they were like, "Oh wow, he's a distributed systems expert," and I managed to spin that off into basically like everyone taking me seriously. And I never wore the Doritos hat gimmick again, and so I didn't become that guy. I think that was another key thing, but everyone remembered that one thing. And then, so Nearform, funnily enough, so the name Nearform, like it's like the shape of things nearby. They were actually trying to invent secure scuttlebutt. And they didn't really know what they were doing or like how they would even do it. They just wanted some sort of thing that was like a local, your local cloud or something. And it was just this very vague idea that they had. And I had been traveling around Europe for a while, and I thought I was going to work for the Swiss company then I met them and decided they were completely insane and there's no way I was going to work for them. But my plan previously had been they would do the paperwork that let me extend my visa, and suddenly I was like, that can't happen. But then I realized I'm in Ireland now for this conference, and Ireland isn't part of the Schengen zone, so it's like, oh, I'll just stay here until my next flight, which is to the US. And then I mentioned to Kian, who organised the conference, I'm just going to stay in Ireland for 2 weeks. And he's like, oh, you should come and stay at my house. And the next day we're driving down to his house, and that is when we discover that we have a mutual interest in data replication. Like, he invited me to stay at his house before we realized there was any kind of like mutual like project thing. And anyway, then they offered me a job, and I worked for Nearform for like a year, and that was like really critical, where I like learned a huge amount of stuff and learned a lot about databases, particularly LevelDB. And they had some like research funding from the Irish government to build this like data sync product, and they didn't really know how to even get started with this. And then I fell into their lap, and then they were like, oh, we'll pay Dominic to do it. And then I did that. And then after a year, they were like, oh, this research, this data sync thing isn't really going to be a good product that will allow us to pay our mortgages and feed our families and that sort of stuff. And we're going to like pivot to this corporate platform as a service business sort of thing. And and they're like, well, what do you want to do? And I was like, in the meantime, I had the idea for Secure Scuttlebutt, and I was like, no, I'm going to continue working on this. Thanks very much. And then I left. But that was like a really like probably a really important thing, because in that year I just like traveled around a lot and talked to everyone, and then all the pieces fell into place. You can go back and look at my early talks from before like 2013, and if you understand how Scuttlebutt works, you can see that I haven't figured it out yet. I have like the pieces of the puzzle that I'm like that are like floating around, but I haven't actually figured out how to put them together in the simplest way. And this is sort of the interesting thing about the whole sort of possibility space of this like secure system stuff, where we have hashes and signatures, and then this idea that would be, oh, really neat if you could build applications out of this. But how do you build applications out of this? That is the question we've been collectively trying to answer for the last couple of years. So I think 2014 was sort of the breakthrough year. That was when the first commits on Secure Scuttlebutt was. And I think DAT and IPFS were also 2014, is that right? About? Yep. So, yeah, and then 2015, I bought a sailboat and started living on that in Auckland in New Zealand. And this meant I didn't travel as much as I had before, but also didn't pay rent. And that meant I had like ample free time to work on very unprofitable business ideas, such as building a peer-to-peer protocol. And I remember Paolo visited me that summer in Auckland, and we're sitting around, and he was like just talking about organizing the first DTN conference. And I think at the time he was like, I want to make a conference for Scuttlebutt. And I was like, no, we should invite DAT and IPFS and BitTorrent and anyone else that's doing stuff like that as well. Because it's better as, if you just don't put all your eggs in one basket. Like, it's the herd immunity. We've got to try different things, and it's even better, I think, not to build the thing that is hugely successful, but just build the thing that influences the person who creates that thing, because then you won't have to maintain it. You think it's funny. Yeah, so that brings us to the first DTN really, and then some interesting things that sort of come off there. So we had been, at the first time of the first DTN, we hadn't even we had the main client for Secure Scuttlebutt, created by Paul Frazee, was called Phoenix, and Phoenix is like a really cool name because it's like, you know, this mythical animal that rises up out of the ashes, and that's also why Firefox was originally called Phoenix, and a whole bunch of other things. And when any one of these projects gets serious enough, they realize, oh, hang on, we can't use the name Phoenix because everything is called Phoenix. Everything wants to call their thing Phoenix. So there was one thing that's unfortunately lost. We had a massive thread on a massive GitHub issue trying to decide what we were going to rename Secure Scuttlebutt and Phoenix to, and every single name had some huge problem. Well, no, actually, every single name someone had a problem with. And even, you know, all sorts of really great suggestions, which I don't really remember, but there were things like Doge Stream and Buru and just all kinds of stuff. And eventually I put my foot down and be like, I'm not changing the name. It's just Secure Scuttlebutt. It has butt in it, whatever, I don't care. And then Paul was like, I want to call the front end Patchwork. And I'm like, great, don't ask anyone else's opinion. Just call it that. And now people come up to me and they're like, I love the name. And so now Scuttlebutt has taken time to like develop its own like particular culture. So like we use the term butt just to refer to people. So you can be like, hey butts, see you butts later. Every butt in the room. And it's like the perfect gender neutral collective noun because everyone has a butt. And nearly everyone thinks it's funny, and then some people are like, oh, you can't say that. And it's like, that makes it funnier. So butts are here to stay. At that time, we had the basic idea of like, there are logs of messages, and you follow each other, and you replicate those. And later that year, that time was like basically at the time of the DTN conference, we were working on a hard fork essentially in the blockchain term, where we just like threw out all the old data and completely started again from scratch. And if anyone, by the way, has a copy of the old data set, because I've completely lost it, but it'd be interesting to gain for security, for historical terms, because there were quite a few people that are still involved today that were on there then, and there were probably some discussions and stuff we had that would be interesting to preserve. So if anyone has the thing, please come find me. And yeah, later that year we got private messages. We had a basic architecture where we had a like core and database and some like plugins, and then just like in my talk I was talking about handshakes to like authenticate to authenticate another peer. That was sort of in place at the time of the DTN. But there are a lot of things. So the next year, one of the major things was I was still learning quite a lot about databases, and one of the big problems we had was with the approach I'd used previously. So you have databases like a database is a library. So you have a bunch of books on the shelf, and then you need ways to find particular books, like for example the particular books on a subject, and then you need a way to make sure that the ways of the indexes that help you find the books are correct, are the same, like reflect the state of the books that are actually on the shelf. And at the time, we had this way where you just wrote when you put a new book on the shelf, you also wrote the indexes at that exact same moment. And that worked well enough for like a prototype, but later we came to realize there was a problem where basically we realized that we didn't know what we were building yet, and we didn't know what kind of indexes you might need in the future. And the way we were doing it, of writing the indexes at the same time, wasn't very convenient for that, because you would definitely need to rewrite the indexes later. And so we sort of moved across to another idea that is often known as Kappa architecture, but I really hate this name because it's completely meaningless. Like if you got if you're doing charades and you pulled Kappa architecture out of the hat, you could probably perform that, but you'd have no idea what it actually meant. There's another version of the same idea called event sourcing, which I think is slightly better because it actually is about the events, the source of the thing. Like it makes more sense in hindsight, whereas Kappa architecture makes 0 sense. But anyway, the idea is basically that when you receive things, that events in the system are stored in a log, and then you process that log from start to finish. And this is sort of one of the key technical ideas, I think, to building a system like this, is you need to have ways of building views and replicating, like here's some state that happens over here, we need to get it over here, but mapped through a thing, and keep that thing, the view up to date with, so when the source changes, the sink changes in a systematic way where you can reason about this is like up to date or not. And I find that this kind of idea appears in has reappeared in a whole bunch of ways, and there's different approaches to it and different ways to make it simple. But the very simplest way is you just have something where it only appends to the end, and then you sort of stream from the start to the end, and then add more, and then process each thing. And in the first thing, when we were just doing with LevelDB, one of the things that was really hard to do was if you wanted to count all of the messages that were in your database. For that, you needed to persist the current count, and when you added a new message, increment it. And there wasn't an easy way to like read the current state and then update and then write the record and read the current state again, where you avoided like race conditions and stuff. But we switched to this log format, and the logs made this really, really easy, because you would just have you'd have a file that stored the count, and you'd read that, and then inside that file it would say where it was up to on the log. Then you'd look at the log and be like, well, the log has been extended since then, so we'll read what happened to the log after then, and then process them into the count, and then just write that again occasionally. And the neat thing around here as well is if you wanted to change how the count worked, you would also just have a version number on the count object that's saved. This is what version it is, and when the code starts, when your program starts running, it wakes up, it looks at the record, checks if the version number is the same as what it expects, and if it's not, it just deletes it and starts again from scratch, like resyncs it completely from the start. And then from the client user perspective, when you do a read, if the view isn't completely up to date, it just waits until it is. And this means that rebuilding the views is like completely transparent to it delays things for a little while, but it's transparent to the view. And this in Scuttlebutt sort of came into place. Actually got merged into in like 2017. Sometime it takes a long time to fix these kinds of things, because when you just write a new software for like the first time, it doesn't have to be better than, it only has to be better than nothing, and that's really easy. But when you have something that is already working and you want to improve it, that's actually much, much harder, because it has to be better than something that people are really using and you don't want to break, and has a bunch of quirks that if you change those quirks, it might break, and it could break unexpected things. So it's much, much harder than doing a new thing. Yeah, and I'll come back to that stuff a bit more. There were also some really interesting things happening in the community around then. In 2016, Andre came on the scene and started to write a Android client and some very excellent blog posts that describes what Scuttlebutt was. And because of that, a whole bunch of, like my personal approach to promoting Scuttlebutt was always just to influence the influencers. Like I just not really that interested in like influencing the masses, but I know some other people are, and so if I put my ideas into their head, then they will do that, and they'll probably do a better job. And Andre did really, really great job, and then some other people turned up, and some of them, so one of them was this guy named Zach, with an exclamation mark at the end, and he had been surfing. I asked him later, I asked him later, how did he discover Scuttlebutt? Because he was actually a stand-up comedian from Washington that had moved to New York that was dabbling in tech. And I was like, he said that he was on Tumblr, he was following, in his words, depressed teenagers, because he said depressed teenagers have a really great sense of aesthetics. And so there'd be all this like sad teenager stuff, and then there would be like bits of like hopeful what I'll come back to briefly. What I'll explain in just a second. And Scuttlebutt appears in that, and he clicks through, and then he's like, "Wow, this is amazing!" And then shortly afterwards, he posts this thing. It's like, "Oh, has everyone heard about this genre of science fiction that's interesting? It's called solarpunk." And I hadn't heard about this at the time, but I immediately realized that this was like the catch-all category that I had been looking for. I immediately realized I am a solarpunk. And so solarpunk is like it's the hopeful genre of science fiction that we've been waiting for. So since like the 80s or something, like science fiction has been overwhelmingly dystopian. And then you have, so that was like cyberpunk. And then you have this like absurd like historical fiction, steampunk, which is, it's like, imagine if the Victorian age just continued and it was like fantabulous or something like this, and you have airships and things like this, completely ridiculous and cheesy. But this established the punk as the suffix, and then people would just like attach punk onto basically anything. And so there was this, the history of solarpunk is traced back to this specific Tumblr post where someone just be like, what if there was this genre called solarpunk? And it's this like future where people are like, it's high tech, but they're living in harmony with nature. So it's like high tech hippies and stuff like this. And I was like, oh, this is exactly what we need. And I realized that like all of my friends who were like, had some kind of optimistic hope for the future were basically solarpunks. already. We just didn't have this word that like encapsulated everything we were trying to do. And now we do. So I make a point of telling everyone about Solarpunk because they're probably a Solarpunk too. And this has become like a big part of the Secure Scuttlebutt community. And I think even the Solarpunk thing, like Scuttlebutt has quite a lot of visibility within Solarpunk as like a Solarpunk thing on itself. Would you agree? Yes, thumbs up, great. And so like the community is growing and like expressing itself and experimenting a lot with different applications. So back like 4 years ago, it's just like you could build all these theoretical applications on top of Secure Scuttlebutt. We have this prototype. But since then, we actually have had a lot of real things actually built. There's like 5, I actually don't know. There's probably more than 5. There's probably 5 that are maintained somewhat or usable. Or people are posting to Scuttlebutt using one of these clients that have different opinions and different interfaces. And this was the thing I really wanted to happen with Scuttlebutt, was that there wouldn't just be like a one-size-fits-all interface to use it. Like there would be different things that suited different people, and you would be able to essentially have the freedom to choose what you wanted. But then there's other completely different applications like Git SSB and SSB Chess. And SSB Chess is actually really surprisingly important because it has this chat panel on the side that's completely encrypted and just between the people that are playing chess. And I don't really play chess on it, but there's like basically a secret stream of like influence between the people that are playing chess with each other and talking to each other completely privately. And these messages aren't like linkable, so none of these things get appear in the thing, but like it's happening, and they're like it's affecting like how Scuttlebutt evolves. So one thing that I thought I was going to be excited about, but didn't really work, is this thing called depject. So it's short for dependency injection, and maybe it's like dependencies are like drugs. The ones that you can like smoke are okay. The ones that you snort probably shouldn't do that. The ones that you inject, definitely no. And so like the idea of dependency injection is like, what if we don't know what we want to depend on yet? We'll just like inject those later. And the idea is that this is like really, create this amazing flexibility, but also creates this indirection where no one has any idea what's going on anymore. And it's sort of this, I tried to build this, and so I basically wanted so this is a thing that's like an intuition I have that I can't really get rid of. Like even though it has failed, I still think it's like maybe there's a way to make it work. But there's this like sort of conflict between, I'm realizing like as basically a back-end engineer type developer, there's this kind of this other kind of, there's more than one type kind of developers, but there's another one that I have to interact with, which is the front-end developer. And Secure Scuttlebutt has always had this like tension between sort of people building back-end stuff and people building front-end stuff, and they're like basically like two completely different genders. They have a different way of experiencing the world and getting satisfaction from it that causes them to write a completely different type of software. Like no one has ever told me that my user interfaces in my CSS design is really good. I can design real good APIs and good architectures. People compliment those, but I'm only getting like user interfaces. I need to collaborate with a user interface developer who has a completely different way of thinking to me. And I noticed that this idea of a modular user interface was definitely something that was kicking around in Secure Scuttlebutt in Stack VM back in the day, and it's kind of like something about it makes it not really work, and I'm not sure what it is. But we tried this like depject thing where basically how it worked is you would say what you wanted to depend on, and other things would inject this. And my idea was that I wanted you be able to just get two different versions of the application or another, basically get two different applications and just smush them together and for that to work. And then now the smushed application just has all of the features from both the applications. And because I wanted a thing where it's like, life is full of like tiny frustrations, and making those frustrations go away is quite satisfying. And as a software developer, you have the ability to do this, except to solve one frustration, you have to wade through like a cesspool of more frustration. So you end up having to pick very carefully which frustrations you are going to address. And so when the frustration is something like the time is presented in AM, PM and not 24 hours or something, or other little things like this, you can like fork the software and you're like, okay, I'll just make my own version where I have different things, but now you're maintaining that fork. And it's basically analogous to like, okay, you can live in the city, and if you don't like that, and there's lots of things that suck about the city, well, you can go live in a cabin in the woods and just do everything yourself. And this is really satisfying if you can make everything really, really simple. But if you want to have, which is, make it simple enough that you can handle all those things yourself. But if you actually, sometimes the changes you want to make aren't worthwhile doing just for yourself. It's only worthwhile if a whole bunch of other people also benefit from that. And then this case doesn't really work. So you get these like big piles of like, here's one software that a lot of people are using, and no one's really that happy with it. Like some people, it's better than nothing, but has lots of problems. And how do you get that? I want to give people like a feeling of like autonomy, that they can affect the changes that they want to see. And this is difficult because there's so many opinions involved, and like you can disagree about small little things. But so far, the best way we have of building user interfaces is you have more or less one person who has great taste and strong opinions, and the asshole with great taste, like Steve Jobs, is the archetype basically. And it's like actually like these are the people who actually make the good user interfaces. But but then the problem is you need to keep them motivated, and so you get it when you're in this situation. Everyone's complaining to you about the things that they want, and that's exhausting. And so it's hard to find these assholes with great taste. No, none of the ones we have in Scuttlebutt are assholes. That's just the comic archetype. You're lovely, actually. But there's lots of people complaining to you, and that sucks. So I want a way to turn those people complaining into people that are actually doing useful stuff. Okay, so I'm going to another idea. I'm running out of time, but this other idea, I noticed that we have like an open collective where people are like giving us money, and we currently have like a couple of thousand euros, I think, which is pretty good for an open source project, but basically pointless in terms of like actually paying people to do things. Like it's just like not very much money. You can't we spend more time arguing about discussing what could be done with that money. Like it's not enough to really do anything interesting, but it's like enough that it's like, oh, we should probably do something with this. And I noticed that people who, giving a few dollars a month seem like a big deal, but the same people were spending multiple hours answering people's questions on Scuttlebutt. So I was like, the time that they're donating is actually way, way more valuable than the money they're donating. So it's like, well, what if I made a thing? What if we made a thing where people just donate their time instead of their money? And I'm calling this the village issue tracker, in the sense that it takes a village to raise a child, but the child is an open source project. There's also the a converse that's like, it takes a child to raise a village. You need to have something for the people to focus on to like bring them together. So we actually have a prototype of this that's I'm just coordinating on like some spreadsheets and threads and that sort of stuff. I actually didn't write any software. I wrote a few scripts to get it working, and I have people have volunteered for it and continued to put in hours. I'm not doing, it's not, everyone's completely free to do whatever they like. So if they choose to do it again, that is very, very good. That's like, so we're winning there. And I want to see where this goes. So this is sort of this is like the 2019 thing. The next DTN, I'll tell you all about how this has gone. Okay, I think I have to go now.